Well, welcome back to our midweek wisdom moment. And these are those times as we're reading the book of Proverbs together each day, a chapter a day, that we just get to spend a moment during the week and just reflect on something we're reading that day. And today we're in chapter 9, and something incredible happens in chapter 9. It is a pivotal moment in this book. Something changes. The structure of the book changes. And as we think of the basic structure of the book of Proverbs that we've seen so far, well, that first part is essentially that purpose part, that initial statement of what this book is doing, what it's trying to communicate, that chapter 1 section. It's small, and we had this last weekend's message, the Sunday sermon was on that chapter and that portion. And then there was this section that I call speeches, or some commentators call them discourses, but essentially they're longer sections of wisdom. And those longer sections are all connected by kind of themes and motifs that run through them. And they're longer sections, and a lot of times people like those longer sections. They go pretty fast as you're reading through them, and they kind of have one solid structure and thought among them. And then today, from today to tomorrow, chapter 9 to chapter 10, there's a pivot moment. And there's this moment where the book changes from speeches and longer discourses to these shorter tidbit proverbs, these 1 to 2 to 3, maybe 4 line proverbs that are short and sharp and memorable. And that structure continues on until the very end of the book, where there's another major transition moment where the last portion of that book, chapter 31, goes back, and it's this long speeches again. It's that long format that we've seen in the beginning of this book. And in particular, chapter 31 is incredibly special because it's not only a speech, it's a giant poem, and it's very sophisticated and complicated. We'll get to that later on. But with this little picture I'm throwing up on the screen, you can kind of outline and see the basic structure of the book. It goes from that purpose in the beginning to these speeches, to these shorter portions, and then in Proverbs 31 back to that longer speech. And so we're in that transition moment, chapter 9 to chapter 10, a changing in the structure of the book of Proverbs. So that means as we look at chapter 9, our senses are heightened. We're looking for something that's happening in this book that might be special at that moment. And there is something special going on in chapter 9. Last week I mentioned how this first section of the book, and really through the whole book, it uses these two women to represent two different choices we can make. We can choose Lady Folly or Lady Foolishness, or we can choose Lady Wisdom. And we're invited to a relationship between one of these two women, one of these two paths. And these two different paths have repercussions and consequences with them that we start to see as we're reading through this. And both these ladies, Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly or Foolishness, are both calling out to us. And in chapter 9, that tension between these two women is escalated. There's an ultimatum moment in this chapter, where we start reading through chapter 9, and we see that it starts off and talks about how Lady Wisdom has built her house, and she's propelled it with 7 pillars. And so she has this wonderful house, and her house happens to be at the highest point in the city, the highest point. And in that house, she has to feast. She has this wonderful meal that she's presenting and preparing. And it continues on in verse 4 and says, Lady Wisdom calls out from that highest point in the city and says, "Let all who are simple, let all who are immature," another word for that, "let all who are simple come in here." She says to those who lack judgment, "Come, eat my food and drink the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and you will live. Walk in the ways of understanding." And then something interesting happens. As we go on, we hear that there's another lady, Lady Folly, in verse 13. And Lady Folly, in verse 14, it describes she sits on the door of her house. And her house is also seated at the highest point in the city, the highest point. And she calls out from that highest point to everyone passes by. And here's the interesting part. Notice her words. They are the exact same words as Lady Wisdom. They both call out and give the exact same words. Let all who are simple come in here. She says to those who lack wisdom and judgment, stolen water is sweet. Food eaten in secret is delicious. But little do they know, right? Both these women are calling out from this high point in the city, and they're both calling out to everyone who passes by, come in here. This is the spot. This is where you need to be. And in verse 18, but little do they know that the dead are there in Lady Folly's house, and her guests are in the depths of the grave. Death is at her house, and life is at Lady Wisdom's house. And here's something interesting that ancient Near Eastern, the original audience of this book, this would have been 100% obvious to them. And in our culture, in our time period, it's just not quite as obvious to us. But what is the highest point in the city? What's the house that's in the highest point of the city? It's the temple. It's whatever the deity's house is at the highest point in the city. And here are a couple pictures for you from places around the world that would give you a little context for that. So here is a picture from Athens, Greece. And you can see the cityscape around it. And that high point right there, that temple, that big structure in the middle of the picture that's at the highest point in the city, the highest house in the city, is the temple to Athena, their deity, the goddess Athena. That is her house, and it would have sat at the highest place. And as we think about this concept of the highest house in the city belonging to the deity of that city, when we start to think about Jerusalem, and here's a picture from Jerusalem, and this is the original temple location that the Jewish temple would have been at, you can almost see how that temple location was elevated. And the temple's been destroyed, but if it was still there, it would be this big structure that would sit up high and would have sat over the top of the rest of the city. It would have been that high point in the city that they're referring to here, the highest house in the city. And so when these passages talk about these two different women, and both women, their houses and their feasts and their places where they're celebrating are at the highest point, and they're calling out from those highest points, we start to realize that in this moment in the book, these two women who, when the book started out, it was totally practical. It was adultery. And then we started to realize, well, maybe there's more here. This is like wisdom and folly that it's talking about. And as it goes further, we realize there's more still yet, right? Wisdom, in this case, is being associated with worshiping the Lord. And folly is being associated with worshiping idols or other deities, these false deities. And little do they know, but actually it's death that's in there. It's leading them to death. And so as we hit this pivot moment in this book, really what's happening here is it's laying out in front of us that we have two paths to choose from. Are we going to choose the path that honors God? Are we going to worship God, or are we going to worship an idol with our actions? And what does it look like to have actions that worship God and actions that worship an idol? Well, pivot moment, right? Through the rest of this section of the book, in chapter 10 through 30, you'll see that what'll end up happening over and over and over is often these parables will be commonly structured in a comparison manner where two paths are compared side by side. And often it uses the phrases, wise fool, two paths. Which one are we going to take? Right? And there are two examples that are placed back and forth for what it looks like and what it means to have a relationship with God and to worship God and to follow God versus what it means to have a relationship with an idol. What does it look like when God is not the one who's in the center of life, when we're not honoring Him in our actions and when we're not worshiping Him with our lives? So as you read through this book and as you look at chapter 9 today and reflect on those words, I would just encourage you to continue to reflect on this idea. Let it settle in the back of our mind that this book, the purpose of it is to lead us into a deeper relationship with God. And so Today, just reflect on those thoughts. Let this just be a moment that takes us one step deeper in this book as we study it together. Have a blessed day and enjoy reading Proverbs chapter 9 and tomorrow Proverbs chapter 10 as we start this new section.